Welcome to the Real Python Podcast. This is episode 222. Should you use a Python virtual environment in a Docker container? What are the advantages of using the same development practices locally and inside a container? Christopher Trudeau is back on the show this week, bringing another batch of PyCoder's weekly articles and projects. We share a recent post by Hynek Schlawack about building Python projects using Docker containers. Hynek argues for using virtual environments for these projects, like developing a local one. He's found keeping your code in an isolated, well-defined location and structure avoids confusion and complexity. We also discuss our development setups, including Python versions, code editors, virtual environment practices, terminals, and customizations. We dig into how your programming history affects the tools that you use. We also share several other articles and projects from the Python community, including a group of new releases, addressing the why in comments, comparing a data science workflow in Python and R, removing common problems from CSV files, and a project for creating HTML tables in Django. This episode is brought to you by InfluxData. InfluxDB is a purpose-built time series platform for ingesting, storing, and analyzing metrics, events, and logs with sub-second query responses and high interoperability. Start now at influxdata.com. All right, let's get started. The Real Python Podcast is a weekly conversation about using Python in the real world. My name is Christopher Bailey, your host. Each week, we feature interviews with experts in the community and discussions about the topics, articles, and courses found at realpython.com. After the podcast, join us and learn real-world Python skills with a community of experts at realpython.com. Hey, Christopher, welcome back.
Hey there.
We're going to do a couple back-to-back things here. We got Python 3.13 coming right up very quickly.
Yeah, it's that time of the year where everyone gets to be tired of my voice. Yeah.
Well, I'm not. I'm excited to dig into the news.
There we go.
And cover a couple topics. And then we have kind of a special discussion this week, which I think will be kind of fun. I don't know if we've hinted on these things a lot, but we're going to talk about our setups, talk about like what IDEs or not IDEs and tools and so forth, and just kind of dig into our Python setups and our coding setups, which I think will be kind of fun as a bit of a comparison. And of course, we got a couple projects. So you ready to start with news?
Yeah, let's go. So a whole bunch of Python release stuff. There have been bug fixes for all the supported versions. So that's 3.12.6, 3.11.10, 3.10.15, 3.9.20, and 3.8.20. Fixes include updates to use a more recent version of OpenSSL, which presumably is a security kind of improvement thing. And there's a whole bunch of bugs for the zip file module, of all things, and miscellaneous other odds and ends. And what would Python release news be without inching closer to the 3.13 release date, as you mentioned?
Yeah.
That's coming up. And of course, we're up to release candidate 2 now. So October is approaching quickly.
That's it, right? There's not a 3 release candidate?
I don't think there'll be another one. It always...
Okay, unless something happens.
They always... Yeah, it's always conditional depending on how it's there. I do know the random module, which we'll be talking about, the new feature does have a bug in it. So they're trying to get that.
Okay.
So there are little bits and pieces they have to still smooth out. So
good people are still trying these betas out with their stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Or release candidates with
That's
their
right. Stuff. And then the other bit of release news is for Django, also a security release. So 5.1.1, 5.0.9, 4.2.16. And there's a denial of service vulnerability and a data enumeration attack. There's a mechanism in there, if you're very, very clever, that you might be able to determine what email addresses are in the database. So go get that patched.
All right. Well, yeah, lots of release stuff. Feels like always talking about a lot of them as we head in here into the fall. Digging into topics, I have a real quick one, and then I'll get into my second one. My first one is on the Polars blog, and it's by Marco Gorelli, and it's actually about a library called Altair and how Altair now has a very lightweight back end for using polars inside of it. And it has to do with a tool that he creates. So this short article is about this framework that's called narwhals. It's a lightweight compatibility layer that does this translation of a bit between data frame libraries. Meaning if you want to support more than one data frame library type, it's now easier to add that support. It's a tool that's for tool builders. It's not so much something that you would install yourself and use in your own projects unless you are building these larger tools and so forth. We're going to talk about it a bunch more. He's coming on the show soon to discuss it. But it's nice to know that adding narwhals to Altair, a data visualization library, has now made it more lightweight and it doesn't have the requirements of pandas and NumPy and PyArrow, which is great. So you can check it out on the Polars blog and have a link there. My first main one I wanted to talk about today is from Hynek Schlawack. It's about Python virtual environments. It's actually titled Why I Still Use Python Virtual Environments in Docker. Hynek is a big proponent of virtual environments. In fact, he has a link that he includes in this article that is from a decade ago, singing the praises of them. So Python 3.3, anyone? He's been using them for quite a while. In that piece, he was speaking about how Docker, this new sort of thing coming along in 2014, it was still fairly new, and how many people felt like it was going to be this virtual environment killer, even at that really early stage of Docker, how you could have this machine-like container and you would just install it like it's the only version of Python that's on there. And he even had at that point inklings that he still was going to use virtual environments. And so this article really digs into that. He has some, really strong opinions about very specific things throughout it and why he wants to do this. He is aware that a single purpose Python Docker container, how they are popular and how many people think that they would be simpler to use, how you're like setting up a machine specifically. And people ask him this question, why not treat them as a machine and approach, via the root Python that's installed on it and, pip install on there. And so across this entire article, he continues to emphasize several points. One, having a consistent way to develop applications, not blindly following advice of others when it may complicate your trusted workflow, and then understanding your structures, your directories, literally where everything is stored for a project, and understanding that and how that's really crucial. So a key pull quote that he has highlighted is, to me, complexity is not about how many keys I have to press. It's about how difficult it is to reason about the consequences of what I'm doing. He has some areas he likes to focus on in this article. One is predictability and familiarity. Even though many operating systems have become simplified, speaking of which, as a Mac user, it's nice that we don't have to worry so much about the system Python anymore. That was one of the reasons virtual environments were popular for some people. He still feels, even though operating systems have become simplified and don't maybe have that system installed, it's still a good practice to isolate a well-defined location and structure for your code. Again, he likes standards. Virtual environments are a core feature of Python. You can employ them across all these different use cases. So if you're doing something local, you're doing a distributed package, or you're deploying in Docker container. So he also speaks to lowering the complexity of imports. And he shares the bonus point, which I think is really a key point that I want to dig into a little bit further. But he writes, hell hath no fury like how I feel about pip install -- user. He argues it's an attractive nuisance that has done much of the damage to Python's bad packaging reputation. He mentions, the troubleshooting struggles that you'll have with users of your tools. I personally have experienced that too, like trying to troubleshoot like why something's not working for somebody else and realizing, well, where did that get installed? And what kind of a mess it is. And so it makes a lot of sense in a virtual environment to have it for that project and build it. And we might discuss that further as we go, depending on what we're doing. But I am definitely one of those people that I build a virtual environment per project. And I think it makes sense as to some of the portability. He shares another post, and this one is really kind of like arguing lots of points and not a lot of like how to actually do it or set it up. So he shares an article that he calls it a living document. It's titled Production Ready Docker Containers with UV, which is a topic that keeps coming up. We might talk a little bit more about that tool. he calls it, like I said, a living document. And so he's, it just updated it a couple weeks ago. What I liked about that one, just kind of glancing through it, is that his code and markdown files in that piece are really well commented as you go through it. And they answer lots of the why as they go, which is nice, not just like kind of what's happening here, but like why he's decided to do this and why it's structured in a way, and mentions stuff like security and things like that. So really nice to follow along and act as reminders as you're going through it. So a few resources from Hynek. Thanks.
You mentioned that he sort of said, don't follow people blindly, and this is something I find with my clients a lot. Right? That's like we end up with that conversation. So, oh well, we're microservices this, and we're doing that, and we're scoping this, and blah blah blah. I'm like, you have 3,000 users simultaneously logged on, and you're a government for a province that is only so large. You're never going to get past the 5,000 user mark. You do not need to scale the way Netflix scales.
Yeah.
So you're creating all this extra challenge for yourself. And this is to his point about the complexity, right? Like now everything you code, all these things have to be asynchronous. Well, that's harder to wrap your head around.
Right.
Now you have to figure out, how these libraries interact with each other, right? And as developers, I think we're very prone to this. It's like, this is the new thing. This is the right way. Google's doing it this way, so it must be the right way. Well, yeah, it's the right way for Google, but there's like 3 companies on the planet should be thinking this way, and the rest of you probably shouldn't, right? So, yeah, the right scale and not copying blindly is important.
Yeah. What's your first one here?
I've got an article by Real Python contributor Ian Eyre called How to Use Conditional Expressions with NumPy Where. Hey, poem. NumPy is a powerful third-party numerics library for Python that lets you do all sorts of mathy kind of stuff. And one of its strengths is array objects, which are kind of like lists, but they allow you to do operations on all the things in the container. So for example, if I create an array with the numbers 1 through 3, I can create a new array by multiplying the first one by 2, and the new array will contain 2, 4, and 6. I hope I did that math right. But what if you want to perform these kinds of actions, say, conditionally on only a subset of the array? Well, that's where comes into play. Where takes 3 arguments: a condition, an action to take if the condition is true, and an action to take if the condition is false. This is kind of like the ternary question mark operator in coding. So let's say I've got an array with a mix of positive and negative numbers. My condition might be less than 0. The true would be multiplied by -1, and the false could be the original array. The returned result would then be an array containing the absolute values of the original. Now, of course, NumPy has an absolute value operator, so this isn't the right way to do this, but it's not a bad example. So each of these 3 arguments to where are actually arrays themselves. So the arguments for true and false are just the arrays that get selected from based on the condition. You pick from this array or that array, depending on the condition. And the condition itself actually is an array, but this one's a little trickier. So NumPy overloads the comparison operators for the array class. So ignore the where function for a second. If you just say, I've got an array, and I say array less than 3 as a line of code, what you get back is a new array of booleans with true for each item where it's less than 3 and false where it's more than 3. So the where function actually takes this kind of array as its argument. And these special kinds of arrays are sometimes known as masks, a term that comes out of bit masking. So you can also combine these kinds of conditions together, but this gets a little funky. If you want to AND 2 conditions, you have to use the bitwise AND operator. So that's the ampersand instead of the AND keyword. This is because the keyword AND isn't overloadable in Python, while the ampersand is. So NumPy is doing some tricky stuff behind the scenes here to overload it and make it behave like an AND condition. We could debate whether this makes things better. On one hand, this means less typing. On the other hand, I get very cranky when someone uses an operator to do something that's very similar to what you're doing, but this is where misunderstandings come from. Anyways, I digress. So in my absolute value example, all 3 arguments were based on operations to the same array. The condition was the array with a comparison operator, the true was the array times -1, and the false was the array itself. But you can also mix and match arrays in your where function as long as they have compatible shapes. So Ian's article goes on to teach you what that kind of compatible shape looks like and what you might be able to do with it. One of the mistakes that newbies sometimes make with NumPy or Pandas or other similar libraries is to loop over the contents of their containers. You can do this, but you're operating in Python land, which is significantly slower. So learning to use tools like the where function keeps you in the low-level land and keeps your NumPy operations nice and snappy. So Ian's article does a good job of showing you just what you can do with where, and even closes out with a section on things you should avoid, stuff you shouldn't do. So if you want to learn some NumPy, this is a great place to start.
Yeah, stay in those methods within the libraries.
Yes, and it's hard because it's closer to functional programming. So if you're used to procedural, it can take a little to learn how to think that way. Yeah,
yeah, it takes you digging in and learning what those things can do too.
Yeah. And particularly when it'll still work the other way. So now you're really talking about a performance thing rather than it won't work, right? So
right.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Familiarity versus
Yeah.
Developers love InfluxDB because it excels in real-time performance for time series data, offering sub-second query responses and scalable architecture. It separates storage and compute using cost-effective Apache Parquet files to slash storage costs significantly. Its open architecture allows direct access to data for analytics, business intelligence, and machine learning, eliminating complex ETL needs. Learn more at InfluxData.com. That's InfluxData.com. All right. Well, we're on a bit of a data science thing here, which is cool, talking about NumPy, and we talked about polars earlier. And so I have another one in this vein. It's titled PythonistR, a match made in data heaven. This is by Cosima Meyer, and it's on her blog. It's based on a workshop that she delivered as part of Women in Data Science in 2023. I like to occasionally feature articles like this. You can do data exploration, data cleaning, visualizations, in either of these tools in Python or in R. But the trick is often understanding how to do that in one or the other. And I've mentioned multiple times that I have a background when I started working at this marketing department. I was just really getting into Python. The shop was kind of split half and half. Some people were definitely more on the R side, and a lot of other people were more on the Python side. And I was like, hey, I'm new. I'll learn a little bit about both. And so that was kind of fun, but probably the hardest part was me crossing over between them. That was always difficult. And what's nice is to see that a lot of it's gotten easier, and a lot of the tools that I liked on one side or the other now are available in both. And so I'm going to focus on the Python thing here, but the entire presentation has tabs on each step of the process of a typical data exploration type of job that you would do. And you can switch and say, well, what does it look like in R to do this? And what does it look like in Python? And so it's kind of nice. You can kind of look at it from there. She shares not only a Jupyter notebook, which gives you resources to run either, but a Google Colab, which is nice so that maybe you don't want to install everything on your thing to kind of go through the presentation. You can log into Google Colab and try it out there. That's what I did in this particular case. Again, I mentioned that it's a typical data science workflow. The examples, it's a data pipeline project. So you are getting data from Kaggle. In this case, it's about taking advantage of mental health services as a professional. And so you're building that data into a data frame. The whole thing starts with pip installing in the case of Python, and then importing the different tools. And you can kind of get an idea of the types of tools that you would maybe use in this experiment as you're going through it. And then you're just going through exploratory data analysis to start. You use those standard methods and tools from Pandas, like what's the shape of the data frame? What's the head look like? Info about it and so forth. And then she used a tool that I had not seen before. I'd heard about that there's some nice EDA type tools that can help you look at your data. This is a feature that I used to really like inside of R, and this tool called R Studio from Shiny, that it had a built-in data viewer in it that you could actually load up the data frame, and off to the side was a window showing you the actual spreadsheet like data frame. And you could do things without having to go into code, such as let's filter on a column, which was awesome, or sort or whatever. Felt very Excel-like for somebody just kind of wanting to just, again, play with data a little bit. I, again, was working in marketing, so it was a lot of text and strings. And so I was able to do things like zip codes and stuff like that, very quickly identify potential problem areas. But this SuiteViz thing is really interesting and very cool. It builds a collection of EDA reports with details on every single column of your data. And it'll show like the values, like how many values are there in the column, how many values are missing, numbers of distinct values, top categories, mins, maxes, and then graphs showing relationships between the values that are inside that column. And it's for every single column. So you can kind of just go through it and get a good idea. That's just a default report, which is really neat. And then you can dig much deeper into it. I just got a taste of it playing with it for a minute, but she mentions 3 other libraries with other options, AutoViz, Pandas-profiling, and Detail. So all of these details spelled DTALE. So this all sounds kind of interesting for this EDA thing and our newer tools than I was familiar with at the time. The rest of the article digs into data wrangling, actually using Pandas built-in methods, things like we've talked about recently, like using the previously mentioned group by method and aggregating data and stuff like that inside there. And then it gets into visualization. I've mentioned a library several times on the show called Plot9, and why it's popular for a lot of data scientists that are straddling that thing between R and Python is it's a lot like the very, very popular ggplot2 library. And both of them use this thing called the grammar of graphics, where you're kind of separating data visualizations into this whole grammatical style of like, okay, here's the data, here's the aesthetics that you're setting up, and then these things called geomes. You can try out each step in either language, like I mentioned. It's all complete in R also. And as Kusama likes to say, why not choose both? And one nice thing also, she's included a few additional resources at the very end of the piece. And thanks again, Kusama, for sharing these resources.
Some of the favorite teams that I've ever worked with, it's been when what programming language are we going to use was the last conversation.
Yes.
It was like, this is the problem. This is what we're trying. Oh, what's best suited for this?
Right.
Learning a language you have to invest so much time in it that it almost naturally becomes religion. They all, the rest of them must suck because this is the one I have picked, right?
Right, exactly.
And there's times when it's easier to get something done in another one. And knowing that, I think, is one of those things that shows maturity of a developer.
Yeah. Very often the jobs that I've had later in my life here that have been data related or, working in a bank or other things like that, they had already had systems. And so I just had to learn whatever tools that they were using.
Yep. Yeah, you're not given any choice.
Yeah. And very often, like there's a bank and they were doing everything in Access. And I'm like, why? Okay.
Yes.
And like I just worked in like a completely, separate SQL shop, what I would argue is a much more robust and,
Yep.
Anyway, Access is its own beast.
Yeah.
That was people, that's that shadow IT thing we talk about a lot. People were
Yeah.
building solutions with what they could.
Yeah.
And
well, and there's just not enough hours in the day to come in and fix it.
right.
Like even if you could, it's like, oh, you've got 500,000 lines of code and it's horrible. And I could do it in 200,000 lines of Python, but that would be a 3-year project.
Right,
And yeah. It's inertia.
I started to do some of that. I was translating some of it while I worked through there and, ways that they could instantly pull reports and stuff. But yeah, it's hard. It's hard to move. But just being comfortable to do that, I think is a really good skill, being able to learn. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
So what's your next one?
I've got an article called Why Not Comments, and it's by Hillel Wayne. We've pulled a few of his before.
Yeah.
Episodes 141, 147, and 206. So he's obviously writing decent content. The article is about commenting your code and addresses one of those arguments you come across once in a while. Correctly selecting names in your code means you don't need comments. So one good piece of advice is comment the why, not the what. And the meaning here is there's no point in having a comment that says adds 2 to X when that's exactly what the code does. That's not typically helpful. And there are those who are more aggressive about not needing comments and will sometimes even argue that the why can be documented as code. Having a long descriptive function name might actually alleviate the need for a comment. So as an aside, Hillel also has an older article called Comment the Why and the What, which he argues that there are cases where the what isn't clear and should be commented. And he's got a beautiful example, which is how you copy an array in Bash. The fastest way to do that includes a $sign, the name of the array, and all 3 kinds of brackets. And so unless you're a bash guru, what is helpful? Because open parenthesis, square bracket, brace bracket isn't particularly clear as to what that means.
Yeah.
Anyway, so what this article is about is actually a third kind of comment, and that's the why nots. There are times when code is doing the non-obvious thing, and a comment that indicates why not to do the obvious thing can be helpful. One example in the article is needing to replace a set of characters in a set of strings. So the easiest way to write the code is just to loop over the characters and call replace over each of the strings. Now, of course, this is inefficient because you're searching each string each time for each replacement. But if you're just doing a quick script and performance isn't an issue, the easy way to write the code is probably less bug prone because you're not having to fix it. You just sort of go. But his point is commenting this kind of code is a signal to yourself in the future saying, hey, I know there's a better way to do this, but this is why I didn't, so that when you come across the code again, you don't spend time second guessing yourself. This kind of thing really can't be self-documented because calling the function run fewer times slower and simpler algorithm after considering trade-offs is just a little messy. So this is one of those places where a comment might be the right answer. The article's brief, but if you've never really thought about this kind of comment before, it's a good thought and gives you ammunition for your next internet flame war.
Yeah, or your code review.
For your code review, yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And by the way, Hillel is working on a book called Logic for Programmers, which teaches you about Boolean logic and how it applies in the coding world for things like database constraints, test coverage, case analysis, and more. So he's already doing an early release. So if this topic is interesting to you, we'll link to it in the show notes.
This week, I want to shine a spotlight on another Real Python video course. It digs into a topic many early developers start to run into as they make their own projects. The course is titled Advanced Python Import Techniques, and it's based on a tutorial by previous guest and Real Python team member, Gerana Hiela. In the video course, my co-host, Christopher Trudeau, takes you through how to use modules and packages, along with namespace packages, and managing those namespaces to avoid shadowing, avoiding circular imports, importing modules dynamically at runtime, customizing Python's import system, and how to use zip to create a package, plus much more. I think it's a worthy investment of your time. After you've learned the basics of using Python's import statement to learn how to manage more complex scenarios and advanced features of the import system. Real Python video courses are broken into easily consumable sections, and where needed, include code examples for the techniques shown. All lessons have a transcript, including closed captions. Check out the video course. You can find a link in the show notes, or you can find it using the enhanced search tool on realpython.com. So that kind of takes us into our discussion, and we've mentioned a few of the topics that we're going to kind of dig into here a little bit. This used to be something I would hear all the time on podcasts, okay, tell me about your setup, like what are you using and so forth. And so we thought we kind of divided into a few sections like, okay, well, what version of Python are you using? We'll talk a little bit about editors, like a primary choice and a secondary choice. Are you in a IDE or not? And then along with that, some customizations that we might have under that, how we're using virtual environments, which is again a repeat there, and then terminal, I guess, sort of practices and maybe tools that you use if you're using anything custom there. I thought I would start going back to the Python versions part of it. I have to always have a caveat here. This is the most unusual work environment I've ever had, in the sense that the work I do is reviewing a lot of other people's work and then also preparing for the show. And so I review a lot of other people's projects and code and check out libraries and stuff like that. So I've developed a thing that I don't know if it would be as useful for other people unless they did what I do. And I do some of my own projects and I follow this sort of same practice now. So I am using Python 3.12 until 3.13 comes along. I don't have a lot of other projects up in the air where I would wait to jump to the newest version of Python, being that I work for a site that creates tutorials on this stuff and I talk about the news of Python. It's kind of good for me to stay on top of this stuff. And so I also have at least 2 other versions installed on my machines. Partly, again, that goes back to the projects and being able to run code if it needs to do that. This usually is data science projects. That's getting a little better. I think we've mentioned it before. The whole Mac Intel transition thing caused some of that, and I'm seeing that get better, which is nice. But right now, yeah, I think I have 3.9, and then 3.11 and 3.12 is kind of like what I have, I think, as far as some of those packages. I haven't touched 3.9 in a little while, so maybe I could probably get rid of it. So maybe we start there and do a comparison. Oh, do we want to do the install, like where we get it from?
Yeah, sure.
Because I install it straight from python.org.
Yeah.
It works for me the best. I get all the resources. I know that tkinter is going to be there, or tkinter, however you want to pronounce it. And I know that all the other kind of resources are all packaged. When you grab it from other sources, sometimes it doesn't. And it hasn't ever bit me in the butt, unlike a lot of other solutions. Again, talking about other people's advice about what you should do. I've had more problems with other people's advice than I have with just grabbing it from python.org.
So I'll see your 2 or 3 releases and raise you 3 or 4 more. So
oh boy,
because of the libraries I maintain, none of my libraries are like thousands of stars, and I'm probably the only person using a lot of them. But for whatever reason, just out of practice, I tend to try to maintain all versions of currently supported Python. So I have 3, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and now 13 on my system.
You've been reviewing 13, right? So,
and what tends to happen is when something gets killed, so like when 8 goes away in November or December this year, when it goes away, the next time I touch one of those libraries, I go in, kick off the bottom one, add the one on top, and sort of cycle it through.
Right.
Like you, I grab all these things off python.org. Like you, I've just never had any trouble with anything else. I also, like you, am running a Mac. When I was using Linux, I would actually use the package managers for this kind of stuff, but I don't play with Linux much anymore. And thankfully, I haven't had to boot my Windows machine up in 4 years, 5 years now. So it's just collecting dust down in the corner. I don't tend to do like the betas and the RCs, except because of Real Python.
Right.
So because I tend to be the one who does the course for this is the new Python that's coming out, I end up grabbing a release candidate. Otherwise, I tend to stay away from anything unless it's a .1 release. And that's not just Python, that's everything. Like I'm not going to upgrade Mac OS until there's been at least one patch. That's just paranoia.
It's audio for me, man. I'm always terrified what they're going to break out of my audio setup.
Exactly. Yeah. And I also don't tend to, it goes deeper than that, not just the interpreter itself, but also the features. So I try not to use a language feature until it's in all supported versions. So I now, and technically I could be using the walrus operator now because I think that was added in 3.8.
3.8, yeah.
I think it's across the board. I haven't found a need for it yet, so I haven't bothered. So unless there's like a real strong need, so like when F strings came out, I was like, oh yeah. I want me some F strings. It solved some problems, but most of the time I don't touch the new features until it's more or less stable. And that's because otherwise, if I'm doing that inside of a library, I'd have to go in and put in conditional code that says, if you're in this, do this. And I don't like doing that if I can avoid it.
Or maintaining it, yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so I didn't mention it, but I do some embedded stuff. So I mess with CircuitPython. I've been out of it for a little bit. I'm going to try to get back into it.
Make it 7. I do that as well. So yeah.
I dabble in those things, and every time it's like, all right, where are we at now? And kind of learning. So as far as editors, I primarily use VS Code. I like it as an editor. I like much of the built-in functionality. It's on almost everything, and it's free. I've been toying around with being able to copy settings files and move them around from installations, but I don't do a ton of customization. I think it's partly just because of the way I bounce around from project to project and so forth. But I was kind of there at the beginning of VS Code coming out when I was at that job I mentioned before. It was something that was just getting released and people were kind of checking it out. And it was nice because I could run it on Windows and I could run it, which was at work, and then I could run it at home on my Mac. And I like that ability about it. I know a couple people that work on it, having done interviews here, which has been interesting. And I like kind of what they've been doing. And I see support behind it, which is really great. People like Brett Cannon, who I've had on the show a ton. I used to use Sublime Text. That was like my main thing. And it was partly because that's what a lot of people said as a text editor, HTML, CSS, JavaScript. That's where I was kind of playing around as I was getting into Python. In fact, that's how I got introduced to Dan Bader's writing. And I think I bought a short course about Sublime Text from him very early on and how to use it for Python. And so I still have it. I got tired of the nag screen, so I paid for it. Gosh, I haven't booted it up in a while, but that was my other one. And then I have to talk about another secondary thing is I do a lot of stuff with Jupyter, mainly because I kind of keep going in and out of data science projects and so forth. Again, that was probably the main tool, and VS Code was my secondary tool at the marketing job. And so I did a lot in Jupyter. I like it a lot. I'm very interested in sort of the future of that format, not only the cloud hosted Colab things, which I think is really kind of interesting, but there's a lot of WASM stuff happening there, which is really cool, where you can kind of create standalone applications that you can send people to where they don't have to have Python installed. And that's very interesting to me. Never got into Vim or Emacs. I know we're going to talk a little bit about that with Mr. Trudeau there. And I think it's just kind of like when I got into the game and what people around me were using and what made sense to me. And I think we'll talk about customizing in a second. But again, I'm not a huge fan of customizing stuff. And I really don't like sitting down in somebody else's super customized thing. It's like nightmare fuel. I'm trying to figure out how do I use this thing that they've completely customized. So what are you using?
Yeah, I'm, as you hinted, I'm VI. I guess it's Vim now. And kind of for the same reason you just gave about VS Code. It's when you started this stuff.
Yeah.
And early on in my career, was frequently having to telnet, before the days of SSH, telnet into another machine. And the only thing that was pretty much guaranteed to be there was VI.
Right.
And so I kind of picked that up. And once you've got that skill and it's still there, it goes. It's actually one of my favorite parts of listening to Michael Kennedy on Talk Python. He always has these outro questions, and one of them is, what editor do you use? And he always makes this disappointed noise when somebody says Vim, and it amuses me.
What is his, by the way? Is he?
He's PyCharm. He's PyCharm.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, he's very strong on that. Yeah.
It's funny because the Python developer survey that just came out, I think it's 3% of us are using VI or something related. But I suspect the number's significantly higher on his guests because it comes up often enough that it makes me smile. So I don't think it's 3% of his guests. I think some of that's an age, and some of it I think is also where you are. So if you're doing a lot of remote work,
right,
having the skill to be able to get whatever editor's in the remote place is important. So anyways, like you, VI is really, really configurable. I've done a little bit, but not much. And for a lot of the same reason you did, is I didn't want to rely on some shortcut that I have put in place, because then when I'm on some otother box, it's not there. And then
you go to remote in, it's not going to be there. Yeah.
How do I do this again? And in fact, I'd forgotten about it. There was one of the shortcuts I did install. There was a little macro keying thing. And it was because there's a couple small differences between VI and Vim. And so I had put in a macro that allowed a key combination that worked for me in VI into Vim. And I was posting something to a board 6-7 months ago going, this isn't working. And can somebody help me with this? And I'm like, I type in this key sequence and then this thing happens and this doesn't work. And they're like, what the heck key sequence are you talking about? And I realized,
that's me.
That's me. That's a macro. I had to go back and go, okay, this is what I actually meant. And it was almost like, not that I did it on purpose, but it was almost like a little test. It was like, how long have you been using the editor? Because somebody old enough would go, I know what that is. That's from 6 versions ago, 15 years from now. But yeah, so it's my primary. I do, like you, I use VS Code and PyCharm. Both of those are sort of secondary and almost always for teaching. So I don't expect my students to, pick up VI. That doesn't make any sense. When I was a development manager, it was actually one of my rules, which was we do not handcuff our developers. I never allowed we are a whatever shop. I don't care.
Yeah.
I will pay for the license, do what makes you comfy. The corollary with that is you're not allowed to use anything for the build that is specific to your tool, so that I have to be able to use it in my terminal.
Other people need to be able to look at it. Yeah.
So if it helps you be a better programmer, great, but don't expect it as part of the build process, right? So both my VS Code and my PyCharm are relatively customized. And it's mostly just turning stuff off because I find a lot of the autocomplete and the highlighting is messy when you're typing on the screen recording, and it gets in the way and confuses people. And it makes it even worse if you have to do a jump cut edit in the edit.
Yeah.
So I tend to have turned most of the squiggly lines and stuff off just to make it a little smoother.
I love it in those REPL tools because that's where you're experimenting anyway. You hit dot and it shows stuff. Like, sure, throw that stuff in my face now, but if you're writing the code, it's so disturbing sometimes. And yeah, it's that kind of stuff I have definitely turned down, try to figure some of that out. So virtual environments, I think I've mentioned that I'm kind of on the Hynek methodology here. In fact, I think I've talked to Brett Cannon about it. I create a virtual environment in the folder of the project. That's kind of the way that I typically do it. I know there's lots of other ways to approach things, but that has worked for me partly because of how varied the projects I kind of get into are. And again, that's just what I'm working on now. I think if I was at a data science job, then I might have a core environment that was like the data exploration environment, and it made sense that this like set of tools would be used all the time, and maybe that would save me some time to point at this specific library. But more often than not, today it's a Django project, tomorrow it's a Flash project, Thursday it's something that's a data science thing, and it's like it's all over the place. So that has worked for me. And then it's, cleanup wise, if I'm not doing anything with that project anymore, I get rid of it. I don't know, it just always kind of made sense to me. And I've been using, I started with virtual env and switched to venv, the built-in one. And yeah, not much to say. I pretty much try to do that in every project I build. It just is a habit.
Yeah.
And we definitely try to do that at Real Python as far as like sharing it as a best practice. It was hard for me to explain it to other people. It was a really common question at the job I had. They were like, why, what? I'm like,
right.
Oh my gosh, this is just what keeps things less messy, Well,
it's one of those things that once it's bitten you in the butt once, then you go, oh.
Yeah, it's one of the best practices things that was harped on in so many different articles that I was like, there's something to this. And I don't know, I just, in my bones, it made sense that this was a good idea.
Obviously, it's partially a Python-specific problem, but there are equivalent problems in other places of programming, right? So like in Windows, we used to talk about DLL hell, and it was the same thing. So somebody would install a DLL, it would be somewhere in a path, and then, oops, it's loading the wrong one from your public place instead of where I expect, and so it finds it, and then it tries to call the function in it, and the function's not there because it's a different version, right? So like this kind of thing is always, and early on, this kind of shared resource stuff was an answer to disk space. Disk space was expensive. So, okay, we'll put shared things in a place, and then we don't need 3 copies of this library. And now disk space is basically free. And my answer to everything is just duplicate it all, because then I don't have to troubleshoot this. I don't have to figure out which version of which SO or DLL or Python file you're using. It's the one connected to this project, and it's all there.
Yeah.
I use virtual env mostly because that's what I've always used, and I've just never switched. I don't think there's a feature in it that makes me go yes or no one way or the other. I have a couple of shortcuts in my system to help me with that. It's as soon as I install a new version of Python, I go in the main, not in the virtual environment, install virtual env in that, so that tool is in the main, and then I can use that tool for creating virtual environments. So it's like the one thing that's in the master. Unlike you, I keep all my virtual environments centrally because I use the terminal a lot, and a lot of the tools that I use will do recursive things. So like find or grep, where you can look through the code base. And because I use those tools, having the virtual environment in the same folder as the project means those are going to get searched as well. And there's ways around that. Like you can just say exclude this directory, but that's more typing and you have to remember to do it and all the rest of it. So having the project somewhere separate means that you're not searching the Python files that are part of your libraries. You're only searching the project. So to me, that's the big reason for keeping it centrally. I do put a soft link inside of the virtual environment to the project, so that if I'm going, what is this 3-letter acronym for?
Yeah.
What is RP 312 again? That was real Python when 312 was in RC. Okay, so I do tend to put a little link there. And I also create a .pyenv file that has the name of the virtual environment in the project folder. So basically I can go back and forth. All of that really is just to get around the fact that I want it central so that I don't have recursive search problems, is really what it comes down to. I'm pretty anal about them. I tend to create new things all the time, although I do have a couple of sort of foo virtual environments. So like when we do projects through PyCoders or through the podcast here, I've got like an RP projects thing that I just constantly pip install into. And 99% of the time, it just generates the cruft. And the first time I run into a problem where there's a conflict, I just blow it away, start from scratch, do that project. So there's sort of an accumulation space.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that I have is I have a ZSH command called act, which takes the name of a virtual environment and activates it. Because they're all centrally located, I can't do the I'm in this project, therefore run it automatically kind of thing. So I've just done a little shortcut for that. And then similar, I've got, that recursive descent searching. I've got aliases for searching Python files and aliases for searching HTML files. So it's basically, it calls grep underneath, but it explicitly greps only Python files or only HTML files, because that tends to be what I'm searching through most frequently.
Cool. I don't know if you want to skip to the terminal stuff.
Sure.
Since it kind of came up. I used to use Bash. That was kind of like the standard thing on Mac, and now they've kind of defaulted now to ZSH or ZSH.
Yeah.
It caused a couple problems. There's a couple things that are handled differently. When you are pip installing something and it's got brackets in it, ZSH hates that. So you have to like put quotes around the thing that you're pip installing if it has any kind of other characters like brackets, like square brackets or something like that. I remember that for like Pydantic or something like that, where like I want to have these features installed with it or whatever. But it would just throw its hands up and get all mad at you. So there's a couple things that are slightly different there. Again, not doing a ton of customizing. I'm sorry, I wasn't much of a Bash type of guy or terminal guy, and so I don't know the commands very well. I have to look them up and get more familiar with them. And so that's one of these things where, I guess I skipped the script kiddie kind of zone of getting really good at that stuff. I know where to find it if I need to, but it's like that part of my brain is like offloaded, and I'll just go look it up when I need it. So pretty straightforward. I used the built-in one that came with the Mac, operating system, which is pretty good. I've learned some tricks that I like about it, like being able to drag a file from the Finder and add the path that way instead of like typing out some crazy long path or something like that, which is nice. I know there's other handier tools and so forth, but that's that, or I use the one that's in VS Code to do stuff that's in there, the built-in window. So I'm sure you got way more than me on the terminal.
No, actually, because most of it is just I'm a little more familiar with the Unix stuff than you are, and so it really is just a matter of those are the tools I use, and that's why I use the terminal. So I probably use it more than you do, but there really isn't much to go on.
Yeah.
I delayed switching to ZSH as long as I could.
It's got some of these subtle differences that are making it awkward.
When I bought my new Mac in February, I finally made the effort to switch over. It took me, 2 days on and off of screwing around to try and get it the way I wanted it.
Yeah.
Most of it was tab completion is different.
Oh, okay.
And trying to figure out, and Bash's syntax for programming it is horrific. And ZSH's is equally horrific, but just in a different way. And then I ran into the problem that ZSH has it built in for certain things. So I wasn't just trying to add what tab completion it had. I was trying to override some of its tab completion. So I just turned certain things off because it wasn't behaving the way I wanted to. So there was a lot of mucking around for a little while.
Yeah. I've definitely played with those customization files.
And if you ask me now how I did it, I couldn't tell you. Like I have to go back into the profile and look at it. But I use iTerm2 instead of the built-in Apple terminal. I suspect the reason why is now no longer important. But for a while, iTerm2 handled color support a lot better. And so I found with certain palettes and things like that, I occasionally was running into problems with the built-in terminal. I do a bunch of preset profiles. So depending on what activity I'm doing, I change what my terminal looks like. So for example, when I'm recording with RealPython, I've got one that uses RealPython's font that we use in all of our slide decks so that the terminal's font matches the font in the slides. And I think Dan should praise me for that. And I don't think anyone's ever noticed, and no one cares, but that's fine. And I also have I have a profile with a bright background that I use when I'm SSHing into another machine. So years ago, I issued a shut down now command in the wrong terminal and took down a massive database when I wasn't supposed to. And
I thought I was local.
Exactly. And so now I use this color as a context clue. So I have one profile that I only use when I'm going remote, and I know if it's the bright beige background, then this is a remote machine. So be careful what you're doing. So yeah.
As I said very often, I like things kind of vanilla. Don't do tons of customization, and so I think that if you have to bounce around a lot, it's nice to at least know like what the default is and be comfortable with it. So
yeah, consistency. Yeah.
All right. So projects, mine's really quick. I have a project called CSV_trimming. Remove common ugliness from CSV files is the sort of subtitle there, and it's by Luca Cappelletti. And the idea is that you have a messy, comma-separated value CSV type file. It could be you grab data from a website, or you scraped it off of a website, or data is coming out of another system and it was formatted strangely or exported weirdly, or it's just badly maintained data, and you want to sort of clean it up and do that before you import it maybe into pandas or polars or what have you. This is a tool that's available on PyPI. With one line of code, you can run some default settings to clean it up. An example might be padding, meaning that there's extra rows and columns that have nothing in them. It's just kind of the way the thing was grabbed or exported. It just removes them, which is really nice. So like any kind of empty rows or columns, it just gets rid of them for them. Maybe there's another thing where you have duplicated schemas along the top for some reason. So the thing that you would normally turn into your header row, it could, maybe it repeated it twice or something like that. It can get rid of that for you. It also has a technique to try to help with something called correlation issues. So like maybe data somehow got added along, and then suddenly there's an extra row that's all empty except for one sort of repeated column. And maybe the idea was that it was like, maybe it's like a name, and there's like first name was the thing that was in the top, and then the surname somehow got added as a row completely empty below it. It tries to help to adjust for that. So lots of these little corner cases. You can run it from the command line, and he mentions in the README doc there the option flags that you use for common tasks. So it's an interesting little project. I think it might be handy for somebody looking for quick ways to clean up CSVs, or just give you ideas on ways to do it yourself. What's your project?
My project is called Django Tables 2, and it's by Jan Pieter Wagermeister. I'm sure I'm butchering that. And as the project's name implies, it's a tool for writing HTML tables. So if you've ever played with the forms module in Django, this is kind of like that. You use a table class based on one of your database models, and then in your template, you use a tag, and the output is an HTML table showing all the fields in your model. In fact, it actually works with more than just databases models. It will work with any iterable, but there's special support for query set objects associated with your models. And that's often the common case, because you're usually just like, I'm trying to display this data. The library supports pagination, the ability to change which fields are shown as columns and in what order. You can add attributes to the columns and rows for stylization, headers, footers, whole bunch of stuff. So pretty comprehensive. There's a settings dictionary that allows you to globally set attributes on tables and their components. So you can say like the T-head tag always has this class. This makes it easy to use the library with whatever style library is your thing. So you can sort of combine them. Speaking of, it ships with these kinds of stylization configurations for Bootstraps 3, 4, and 5, as well as semantic UI. So if you're using one of the common ones, it's already there for you. If all this isn't great enough, it also integrates with Django filter and to filter the contents of a table, and it integrates with the tablib package to do exports. So very cool little tool. If you're writing tables in Django, you definitely want to check this out.
Sweet. All right. Well, thanks again for bringing all these projects and topics this week. Well, I'll talk to you soon about 3.13.
Yep.
And don't forget, for your time series needs, use InfluxDB. It's trusted by leading companies for its scalability, real-time performance, and easy integration with modern data stacks. Start for free at InfluxData.com. I want to thank Christopher Trudeau for coming on the show again. And I want to thank you for listening to the Real Python podcast. Make sure that you click that follow button in your podcast player. And if you see a subscribe button somewhere, remember that the Real Python podcast is free. If you like the show, please leave us a review. You can find show notes with links to all the topics we spoke about inside your podcast player or at realpython.com/podcast. And while you're there, you can leave us a question or a topic idea. I've been your host, Christopher Bailey, and I look forward to talking to you soon.